the astronaut cat is back, which means that it's time for the second part of the official bookshelf tour here that I'm doing. Part 2, which is when we're going to get into the secondary sources. If you haven't watched the first one, then that'll be on the channel. This time I'm going to have to film this myself, but maybe that's going to be, you'll get more of a close-up on the books, I suppose. Okay, here we are. So we ended the primary book section, I think, here, right, last time. So the secondary sources starts also chronologically, so there's a similar structure to it, although unlike the primary sources, the secondary sources are divided or categorized into different categories. So primarily this is the religion section, so this is it's grouped into different religions, and they are sort of placed somewhat chronologically, you could say. So it begins with this book on ancient Egypt by Rosalie David, Ancient Religion and Magic in Ancient Egypt. I got this a long time ago, actually. I think I got this when I was in the British Museum, over 10 years ago or so. And then this excellent book, I've used this a lot in my videos. This is Jan Assmann's classic, The Search for God in Ancient Egypt, where he examines the evidence for this idea of there being this conception of a one God in ancient Egypt, right? This one sort of pantheistic idea of God, which Jan Assmann argues there is, whereas this guy, Eric Hornung, argues that there isn't such a thing, although not in this book. This is the only book by Hornung that I own, which is a book on Akhenaten and his Cult of the Aten. This is Akhenaten and the Religion of Light, which is a short but classic book on the subject. We got Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia by John Botero. I used this a lot in my video on Religion in Mesopotamia. This is strangely enough, at least last time I checked, the only dedicated monograph to religion in ancient Mesopotamia. Very good, very useful. Got 2 books on Zoroastrianism, one by Mary Boyce, a more sort of classic one, and then a more recent one in this series, this Zoroastrianism, an introduction by Jenny Rose in the Bloomsbury sort of series of introductions to different religions. This one I find, they're both good. This one I found personally a bit more useful perhaps for when I was doing my video on Zoroastrianism. This is an excellent book here as well. This is Yulia Ustinova's Divine Mania, Alteration of Consciousness in Ancient Greece. This examines different traditions of altered states of consciousness and, quote-unquote, mysticism in ancient Greece. So from the Bacchic cult to the Eleusinian mysteries and all kinds of wonderful stuff. So very highly recommended. Here's another great classic if you're into, ancient Greek philosophy and religion, The Pre-Socratic Philosophers by Kirkraven and Schofield. This is a must-have for anyone who studies this topic. Really is the best sort of source for, one of the best at least, for pre-Socratic Greek and Hellenic philosophy. Speaking of which, right now we're in the sort of Hellenic section, I suppose. So we have here some Stoicism. So this is the philosophy of Chrysippus, the great early Greek scholar of the Stoic school in Athens. Really wonderful book. This is also quite an old one. It's a classic, but Chrysippus, I love Chrysippus. He's, in terms of all the Stoics, Chrysippus is probably the most important or significant one, at least for the sort of Greek Stoics. So that is a very useful source. Unfortunately, very little, if anything at all, really survives of Chrysippus's writings. unlike the Roman Stoics, like Aurelius and Epictetus and so on. But this goes through some of those surviving fragments and stuff that we find in other sources. Here is the Egyptian Hermes by Garth Fowden, one of the great books on Hermeticism, I would say. Very highly recommended. And of course, got to have some John Dillon. This is the Middle Platonists. Also a must-have for anyone studying Platonism. Next here is a bunch of stuff on Neoplatonism. So we have this Wallace edition, just Introduction to Neoplatonism, and then both of the Cambridge Companion to Plotinus. So this is the first one, which I forget when it came out. They're both edited by Gerson primarily. And this is the second one, the new Cambridge Companion to Plotinus. Originally, I thought this was just, a new edition, a second edition of the work, but this is actually a completely new book, right? So for anyone out there who is as confused as I was, this is like all new articles and chapters that are not in the first book. So both of them very useful for studying Plotinus. And then, so anything that's on top like this are borrowed books, so we don't have to go through them. Some Iamblichus. This is the fairly recent book by Gregory Shaw, Hellenic Tantra, which I haven't read through completely yet. I've read only parts of it. Very interesting, sort of comparing the non-dual, at least according to Shaw's interpretation, the non-dual Neoplatonism of Iamblichus with like Tantra, like Kashmir Shaivism and that kind of tradition. Very, very interesting. It's a sort of follow-up to his original book called Theurgy and the Soul, which is one of the sort of great texts on Iamblichus, which I don't personally own, but have read and found very useful. Now we're getting into some Judaism. This is an introduction to Judaism in Swedish. Here's a wonderful biography or book on Maimonides, which, if you want to get into his life, and that's very useful. We got this other book by Oliver Leaman, also on Maimonides. We've got the classic book on Kabbalah by Moshe Idel, Kabbalah New Perspectives. A lot of Idel here. Two books essentially on Abulafia, one of the most interesting of all the Kabbalists, and his so-called ecstatic Kabbalah. This is perhaps the best source for that, I would say, the mystical experience in Abraham Abulafia. And then a sort of companion volume, this is Studies in Ecstatic Kabbalah, which is, that school of Kabbalah that he basically founded. So it's broader, but it's mostly focused on him still, I would say. Here's also a really great book on Isaac Luria and the sort of Kabbalistic environment in Tzvat in the 16th century, specifically on Luria and his legacy. Very, very interesting, very good book. Here is another classic. This is a heavy one. This is The Philosophy of Spinoza from Harvard University Press. So if you're into Spinoza, then you've got a lot to bite into there. Okay, next shelf. I got some Bruno that I'm currently reading, preparing a video about that. Here is more Spinoza. This is the Cambridge Companion to Spinoza. Got some more Judaism. This is a Swedish book on Judaism. Then we're getting into some East Asian traditions. So an introduction to Eastern religions by Christer Hedin, who is a fairly recently passed Swedish professor of religion, one of the all-time greats. And he wrote this book on Eastern religions. Here is an introduction to Hinduism. And then there is some literature on Hinduism here. So we've got this book on Advaita Vedanta. This is sort of a philosophical introduction or interpretation, I suppose, of Advaita. It's good for an introduction. It's by Dutch. but it sort of strips it of all the religious aspects and really tries to just give sort of philosophical perspective. I mean, that's the title, right? It's Advaita Vedanta, a philosophical reconstruction. We've got this Routledge book by Bartley on Ramanuja, the theology of Ramanuja. Quite a heavy book, I would say, like difficult to get through, not because of the quality or anything, but it's like a heavy subject. Here's a book on Madhva, who's the main figure of Dvaita or dualistic Vedanta. Also very good. Now here is some more Kashmir Shaivism. We saw a lot of that in my previous one on my primary sources, and here's some Dishkowski. Again, the doctrine of vibration, one of the great classic introductory works to Kashmir Shaivism. Also Paul Miller Ortega, The Triadic Heart of Shiva, very useful for that as well. There's a book on Kabir, the great Indian poet, who I should probably be making a video on eventually. Very interesting figure, very important, for his sort of the way he sort of straddles the lines between Hinduism and Islam. You're not really sure where he fits in, and that also, I think, plays a part in the emergence eventually of something like Sikhism. Is really only possible because of people like Kabir. So very interesting. Here is a suite of books, 2 books by Guy Beck. Really beautiful books. This is Sonic Theology, Hinduism and Sacred Sound. This is amazing if you're into, if you're into Hinduism generally, but like specifically the way that sound and music is used in Hinduism and the Indic traditions generally. Sacred music and sacred sound and all of that. It's really, really beautiful work. And here is the follow-up to that, which is Sonic Liturgy, which is more focused on the actual sort of ritualistic uses of music, whereas the first book is more so the philosophical and metaphysical aspects, perhaps, of music and sound from different perspectives. So there is, some stuff on the yogic school. There is some Abhinavagupta. There is, Nyaya. It goes through different schools within Hinduism and how they view sacred sound in different ways. Really, really beautiful book. Both of them, really. Here is, again, one of those introductions in the same series as the Zoroastrian one. This is on Jainism by Jeffrey D. Long. As you can see here, there's some Buddhism, Swedish introductory book. This is all like course literature that I had when I used to study at university. I still have these books. Here's also a great book on Tiantai Buddhism. This is a school of Buddhism originally from China that has a really interesting philosophy. So this is Paul Swanson, by the way. So this introduction to Tiantai. Tiantai is it's a branch of Mahayana Buddhism. And if Mahayana has this idea of the 2 truths theory, right? The relative or conventional truth and the absolute truth, Tiantai proposes 3 truths. There's the conventional truth, there's the absolute truth, and then there's the truth in between, in which all the distinctions between the 2 truths are unified in this non-dual kind of thing. It's a really profound and complex philosophy that I've been meaning to do a video on for a couple of years, but haven't gotten to it. This is another book on the same school, Tiantai Buddhism. This is Emptiness and Omnipresence by Brooks Boren. This isn't so much an introduction in the same way that the other book is. This is kind of a modern philosophical contemplation on the teachings on Tiantai, and it's beautifully written. So this is highly recommended just for that. It's like a great philosophical book. I'm gonna move these away. This book on Chan Buddhism by Peter Hershok that I used a lot from my Chan or Zen Buddhism video. Also another book on Chan by Chuang-Tzu, whom I am most definitely mispronouncing. Here is a friend of mine and a great scholar, Anthony Fiorucci, on Buddhism, I think. Right, so it's focusing on karma and sort of aesthetics, I think, in Buddhism. It's his PhD dissertation. After that, we get to some Taoism. So we've got this is actually more of a general book on different Chinese traditions. A.C. Graham's Disputers of the Tao, the title of which I totally stole from my series on East Asian traditions, which is called Disputing the Tao. So it's a sort of nod to this book. This is a great classic and highly recommended for studying, especially ancient Chinese philosophical and religious traditions from the sort of Warring States period. Very good. Here is a book I always recommend if you want to get into Taoism, The Taoist Tradition by Louis Kamjati. Very good, relatively short as you can see, but so scholarly, such great scholarship, very nuanced and historically rich. So highly recommended. Can't study Taoism without some Livia Cohn. This is her Early Chinese Mysticism. Great book. And then also a wonderful study that she's done on the Zhuangzi, which is again one of my favorite texts, the second great text of Taoism. This is a book that's sort of, it's like a commentary basically on the Zhuangzi from different perspectives, which, if you want to dive into that text even deeper, then that's very useful. Here, a book on Shinto, John Breen and Mark Tuen, on the Shinto religion. Here is a Swedish book on Old Norse religion, Fornnordisk religion. Very good. The Viking Way by Neil Price, which is also focused on Old Norse traditions. This is, I think Neil Price is primarily an archaeologist, right? Or he's either historian or archaeologist, but this is a very archaeological book. So we sort of focus on different archaeological finds and objects, but tells the story of those objects and how they played into the traditions in really beautiful ways. It's got beautiful illustrations and all that stuff, so definitely recommended. And then we'll get into some Christianity here. Introduction here to Christianity. Another introduction to Christianity. Got the late Timothy or Callistus Ware, his book on the Orthodox Church. And of course, you've got Vladimir Lossky's Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, the great, another classic work in that field, highly recommended. We've got some Eckhart, of course. This is, if you want to get into Eckhart and, if you want secondary literature on Eckhart, this is the book to go with. It's, of course, Bernard McGinn, The Mystical Thought of Meister Eckhart, the man from whom God hid nothing. This is incredible stuff. Incredible. It's just a sort of book on, Eastern Orthodoxy in Sweden. Some Reza Aslan, if you remember. This was on a lot of people's lips back when it came out. Zealot about Jesus. The Gnostics, David Brackey's book on the Gnostics. One of the best books on that topic. Move down here. Next shelf. I'm borrowing and rereading Wael Halak's work on Sharia, which isn't mine, but still, one of the great works on that topic. Okay. We've got some more Gnosticism here. This is Gnostic religion in antiquity. Also very useful for that. We've got some Cathar literature here. Book on the Cathars. I use this one a lot for my video on the Cathars. Another one, this is the book that really sort of challenges this idea of, or asks the question rather, whether the Cathars even existed. Cathars in question. And it's not, the question isn't really whether they existed, but whether they existed as they were portrayed by the Catholic Church at the time. Here is a beautiful little book It's in Swedish though, but if you're Swedish and you want a good book on, it's primarily on Swedenborg, but specifically Evangelii. I think I talked about Evangelii last time. Swedish painter who converted to Islam. He was originally a Swedenborgian, but eventually sort of became a Sufi and very much in the school of Ibn Arabi and so on. Important figure for early development of the perennialist school. He initiated René Guénon into Sufism. This little book is written by my old supervisor, Simon Sorgenfrey, who's an amazing writer. So if you know Swedish, then check that out. This is Aztec Philosophy. This is a book that I got many years ago at this point, but still haven't gotten to reading. But I've heard very good things about it, so I look forward to that. Here's some Sikhism, a guide for the perplexed, a book on the Baha'i faith, an introduction to the Baha'i faith, a book on secularism in Swedish, 2 books by also my old professor, David Tufjell, this one's about basically the religiosity of modern Swedes, particularly their sort of post-Christian way of relating to religion, a sort of modern classic almost, I guess, in Swedish, in the Swedish field of religion. His other book, Granskogsfolk, whom I interviewed him about a couple of years ago in my video about, nature being the religion of Swedes, basically, or Scandinavians. So I have that interview on the channel if you want to check it out. By the way, here, this is the shot that you see behind me when I do my videos for the most part. So I'm sure you've seen these icons before. This is one of, obviously, of Jesus here, and then Mary and the younger Jesus. These are both from the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. I was there in 2017 as part of a trip with my old, the institution where I used to study when I did my master's. So when I was studying with David Tufjell and Simon Sorgenfrey, we were there together. This is the spring of 2017, I believe. And we went to the liturgy, basically, or I did, on the Sunday there in the cathedral, and it was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had in a religious building. I would say it was incredible. I walked in. It's a big church if you've ever been there, and the priests were sort of reciting at the front, and then suddenly this choir from the way back in the room just responds, right, with just these angelic harmonies, vocal harmonies, and I just chills unlike anything I've ever felt before just went up my spine. I remember that very, very clearly, and so I got these icons in that church either the same day, like after that, or the day before or something. But anyway, I associate these icons very much with that visit and that very powerful liturgy that we experienced. We're gonna move these over a bit so we can do here. Okay, so here's Henrik Olsson, a recent book by recently another friend of mine who's an academic, published this in Swedish, also about sort of nature, spirituality and stuff like that. A very, very beautiful book. Some book on New Age traditions, some books on sort of theories of religion. This is Swedish, so like theory, academic theory on religion. Here is a book on fundamentalism, specifically, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's focused on Islam and sort of fundamentalism and terrorism. This is also a PhD dissertation by my friend Ingela Visuri. This is a beautiful piece of scholarship about people with autism and how the kinds of religious experiences that people with autism has. And it's a really wonderful exploration of this sort of interdisciplinary study Got some spicy topics within religion here. God needs no passport. This is about migration, basically, how religion and migration affect each other. You know, how people who migrate to new places, they carry their religion with them, and how that plays into their integration or lack thereof, and how they understand themselves in new contexts. So another really great piece of scholarship. Here is, speaking of perennialism, this is Mark Sedgwick's book on the traditionalists. Here is a book also on another perennialist book, actually, kind of. This is the son of Tage Lindbom. Tage Lindbom is one of the great Swedish perennialists of the 20th century. And this is his son that's written a book about his father, basically. Here is a book. This is The Esoteric Sweden. This is a beautiful volume. Came out just very recently. And I can possibly get this out of the way. This is beautiful because it's about all kinds of, you know, esoteric topics in Swedish: occultism, esotericism. Now, just because I wanted to show you illustrations, I can't find them. So here, see, it's really, I love this one. Okay, so that's some Swedish esotericism there. And then this is a book on Satanism by Per Faxneld and Johan Nilsson. Also a fairly recent book. It's primarily primary sources, so it could go in the primary sources section, but I chose to put it here because it's also very much a kind of academic secondary literature as well. Very good for studying modern day Satanism, and I used this a lot in my Satanism video, and I also interviewed Per Faxneld himself for that video. So all that is on the channel. Now, here, as you can see, we're getting into some Islam. And as you know, I hope most of you know, Islam is my field of expertise. And so it's going to be compared to other topics, there's a lot of Islamic literature here, naturally. Here's a book, an introductory book on Islam, again by my old supervisor, Simon Sorgenfrey, and Susanne Olsson. Another Reza Aslan book. So before I started studying religion properly, I read some Reza Aslan. So I think, this is actually a pretty good book on Islam. I haven't read it in many years, but as I remember, this is quite a good book. This is a book on basically the sort of environment in which Islam emerges. So the sort of socio-political milieu, right, where Islam emerges. Najm Haidar's book on Shi'ism, Shia Islam, an introduction. Good stuff. The Origins of the Shia by the same author. This is not so much about the origins of the Shia. This is actually more of a book on the environment in Kufa in the 8th century. So that includes, the Hanafis and so on. So it's more about that environment and the Zaydis and how that all plays together. But it's a very good piece of scholarship. This book on Shi'ism, very good. We've got two classics by Muhammad Ali Amir Muezzi, the Divine Guide in Early Shi'ism and the Spirituality of Shia Islam. These books are really great for exploring the really sort of esoteric and mystical aspects of Shi'ism, especially early Shi'ism. Really incredible books. Of course, Farhad Daftari's massive tome on the Ismailis, really the sort of standard work if you want an overview or introduction to the Ismailis. This is the book to go with. Next shelf. We've got the classic Martin Ling's biography of the Prophet Muhammad. This is a much beloved biography of the Prophet based on the sort of Sirah literature, the early Sirah literature. It's loved by both academics and by Muslims themselves. Another one of the great perennialists, right? Martin Lings. And this is another biography of the Prophet by Karen Armstrong, very different in nature. Still very interesting, a very human portrait of Muhammad. And very interesting just for that perspective. You know, this one very much follows the sort of traditional hagiographical version of his biography. This one is a lot more human, more down to earth. And so I appreciate it for that reason. Here's a book on the Abbasid, the golden age of the Abbasid Empire. This is another book that I haven't read in many years, but I remember it as being very good. And okay, so here's two books now that are in the great series of books called Makers of the Islamic World. And this is another title that I've totally stolen. My series on Islam on YouTube is called Making the Muslim World. So, you know, I'm not that creative with the names. It's an homage to this series. This is chronological. So this is like the earliest one. This is a book on Abdurrahman Amr al-Awza'i, who is one of the great early jurists in Islamic jurisprudence and Sharia. He's one of those early founding figures of that discipline, although there's no school necessarily that survives based on his teachings, but still he's still well referred to and remembered today. Another one in the same series on the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun. Interesting figure. Of course, you gotta have Hugh Kennedy's Muslim Spain and Portugal. Great historical account of that whole civilization. Halaq, you know, you saw the Sharia book before that I borrowed, or that I am borrowing. Halaq is one of the great authorities on Islamic law, and this one I actually own, The Origins and Evolution of Islamic Law, which is also, both of those books are great introductions to Sharia and Islamic law. You've got this, The Canonization of Islamic Law by Ahmed al-Shamsi. It's actually, you know, the title kind of, it doesn't lie to you, but it promises a broader topic than it actually delivers. This book is actually particularly focused on Imam al-Shafi'i and the impact of Imam al-Shafi'i on Islamic law. So of course that is a very important part of the canonization of Islamic law, but nonetheless it's very much focused on him and the emergence of his school in particular and what that meant for Islamic law. So very, very beautiful book, very great, another great piece of scholarship, but just beware that's what you're getting. The Cambridge Companion to Islamic Theology. This is a good introduction to that topic. I've heard many people, and I've read both. I've heard many people prefer the Oxford Introduction or Oxford Handbook to Islamic Theology because it's a bit more, it's more inclusive in terms of representing different schools of Islam and branches and so on. But this is still very useful. We got this Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy by Peter Adamson and Richard Taylor. Also very good. Neoplatonism and Islamic Thought. It's exactly what it sounds like. So, you know, if you're like me, you love both Islamic history and theology and Neoplatonism, then, you know, what are you waiting for? Alexander Knish and his book on Sufism, very good. He has written another book on Sufism that I really, really like, that I unfortunately don't own, but I think it's just called Islamic Mysticism, A Short History. It's published by Brill, which I would recommend more as a sort of first book or as a basic source. This is also very good though, and more recent, so also recommended. Cambridge Companion to Sufism. We've got Jamal bin Nasser, Jamila bin Nasser, excuse me, Muslim Communities of Grace. So this covers, this is a book on Sufism, on Sufi tariqas, brotherhoods. So it goes through some of the major orders of Sufism, their history, some of their teachings. So very good for that reason. A Swedish book on Sufism and Sufism today, or rather, I think back in the 90s when it was written, early 2000s maybe. Sufism and the Modern in Islam. Great piece of scholarship. Here is Umid Safi's book on radical love. So this is a translation of various poems, primarily Persian Sufi poems. This could definitely be in the primary literature section because it's mostly just translations. It's basically all translations. So I'm not sure why it's here. I think maybe because it's such a collection of different authors that I'm not sure where to put it chronologically, but still beautiful translations of some of the great poems from the Sufi tradition. Here's an incredible book by Carl Ernst and Bruce Lawrence, Sufi Mothers of Love. It's a book on the Chishti Sufi order in particular, the great Chishti order in India. Yusuf Kayswitz, The Mystics of Andalus. This is particularly focusing on a Sufi called Ibn Barajan, who was a mystic from Sevilla in the 12th century, one of the sort of predecessors, you could say, to Ibn Arabi. Here's another one in the makers of the Muslim world. This is Ibn Tufayl, the author of the great novel, Hayy bin Aqsan, the philosophical novel. This is definitely, it's about his life, but it's also sort of an interpretation and a summary of that book. I was recently in Morocco, and there's a lot of Sufism and Islamic mysticism to explore there, and one of the great sources for that, one of the great academic books about this topic is Vincent Cornell's Realm of the Saint. So, which I highly recommend. It's dense because it's a dense piece of scholarship, but that's also why it's so incredible and so beautiful. This is a must-have if you're into Western Sufism, so to say. This is the literature of Al-Andalus. So it's a collection of a bunch of different literature from Al-Andalus, everything from Ibn Arabi to Jewish thinkers, Ibn Ezra. I think, who else is in there? Ibn Gabirol, another Jewish thinker. I think Ramon Llull is in there. So a bunch of thinkers from different religious traditions from Andalusia. This is a very good volume. It's quite expensive, I think, at least the places I found it, but very useful for studying Andalus. Here, of course, from last time that there's a lot of Ibn Arabi in the bookshelf, and here is secondary literature on Ibn Arabi. We've got the great biography of Ibn Arabi by Claude Hadas, the best biography, in my opinion. The Quest for the Red Sulphur. And look at this cover. This book is beautiful. There's another biography of Ibn Arabi that's also very good. The Unlimited Mercifier by Stephen Herzenstein. This also includes... The Claude Hadas one, the Quest for the Red Sulphur, is basically just a biography. Not really, but for the most part, right? It goes through his life in a very meticulous kind of way with proper sources. This one is a biography, but it also goes through many of his teachings, right? So every other chapter goes through certain aspects of his philosophy that is relevant to whatever the biographical, to what's going on in the biography at that moment, right? So both are very good. You should get both of them if you really want to dive into his life and teachings. Here is William Chittick's introduction, Ibn Arabi, Heir to the Prophets, from the Makers of the Muslim World series. Another Chittick book, The Self-Disclosure of God, This is very heavy. It's double-paged text, right? And it's quite long, as you can see, right? So this is kind of a follow-up to his Sufi Doctrine of Knowledge. Is that what it's called? The Sufi Path of Knowledge, right? Which is his classic book. And this was sort of a follow-up to that. Both of them very good introductions to Ibn Arabi. I have two works here by Dunya Rasic. This is the written world of God, about Ibn Arabi's ideas about the mystical power of the letters, which he dedicates so much of his Futuhat al-Makkiyah to. The first couple of chapters basically is dedicated to that, and it's incomprehensible. But Dunya Rasic has done a great work of trying to make sense of some of that, and this is a beautiful book. And then a more recent one called Bedeviled, which is about the tradition of the Qareen in Islam, which is this idea of a personal jinn. Everyone has their own personal jinn doppelganger, as she calls it. And so this is a sort of exploration of the Akbari interpretation of that. So the school of Ibn Arabi in particular, right, and how they see that tradition, how they interpret the Qareen. Very interesting. Ibn Arabi and Modern Thought. We got two editions, or two, what do you call it? Two books from the Journal of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society that they sent out to members. We've got two books on the great Egyptian Sufi poet Ibn al-Farid, both by the late Ibn Humarain. This is a good introductory book, and this is a more in-depth book. This is Passion Before Me, My Fate Behind. This is a more sort of, how should I say it, a sort of a study of his poems, whereas the first book there is more of a sort of biography and overview of his life and legacy. This is a strange book on Ibn Sab'in. I don't know what to make of it. It seems to be sort of just a collection of different things that can sort of copy and pasted into it. I don't know. It's not a great edition, but it's got some good information on Ibn Sab'in if you're interested in the topic. This one, I think a lot of you have seen. A lot of people have commented on this in the comments and wanted to know what this book is. This is the best, maybe, book on Rumi that you can get, at least in terms of his biography and sort of overview of his life and thought. Rumi, Past and Present, East and West by Franklin D. Lewis. A big book. A very good book. This is the standard source, basically, for Rumi, in English, at least. Very, very, very good. Very thorough, very well written, very engaging. If anyone asks me what book should I read about Rumi, aside from reading Rumi's own works, this is the first one that I always mention. It's this or Chidik's Sufi Path of Love. I think both of them are really great introductions. And speaking of which, here is another William Chittick. This is an old one, I believe. This is the Sufi Doctrine of Rumi. It's not just Rumi, though. A lot of it is Ibn Arabi. It's also a beautiful volume with a lot of illustrations and stuff like this. You can see. This is nice, right? It's a very, Chittick, of course, belongs to that tradition of Shuan and the perennialists, and so it's a very perennialist interpretation of Ibn Arabi and Rumi, but very beautiful little book, I would say. And then now we're at the bottom row here. Simon Sorgenfrey, my old supervisor again, his old PhD dissertation, American Dervish, about the Mevlevi order in America. A book specifically on the music tradition of the Mevlevi order. So this is the Mevlevi section. The Whirling Dervishes, music, poetry, and mysticism in the Ottoman Empire. Here's some more in that series, The Makers of the Muslim World. Got one on Amir Khusro, the great Indian Persian poet of Sufism, from the Chishti order, one of the students of the great Nizamuddin Awliya. Ibn Taymiyyah, who many consider the father of Salafism. It's a book on him and his legacy. There's a book on Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Khaldun Life and Times. Here is a book on Fazlallah Astarabadi, Fazlallah Astarabadi and the Khurufis. A very interesting figure. I've made a video on him, and this is one of the only really books that are dedicated to him, so highly recommended. A book on Aisha al-Ba'uniyah, a great female Sufi poet from the 16th century, also by the late Imam Khomeini. Of course, got to have one on Mullah Sadra as well. These are all recommended, right? They're very short, very bare bones, these Makers of the Muslim World, but very good. Short but to the point. Highly recommended. This one I've recommended many times, I think, in my videos. Supriya Gandhi's book on the Prince Tara Shikoh, the Emperor Who Never Was. This is a beautiful piece of scholarship. This is an incredible book, actually. It's so engaging and historically and it's rich and engaging to read, but also deeply scholarly. Can't recommend this one enough. We have the somewhat controversial book on Aurangzeb by Audrey Tresky. Another one in the Makers of the Muslim World on Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, a great Sufi in the tradition of Ibn Arabi, from Ottoman Damascus, a great Arabic Sufi figure from the 17th and 18th century, I believe. Another book on the same guy by Elizabeth Siriyeh. Here's a book on, I'm going past these pretty quickly. You can pause and check them out if you're interested. This is a Sufi sage of Arabia on the founder of the Ba'alawi order. Here's a couple of books also on West African Sufism, which some of you might know was the field that I studied when I did my master's and my bachelor's. And so we've got a book on Sufism and religious brotherhoods in Senegal, a Swedish book on the Muridiya order, specifically about women in the Muridiya order. This is a great book on Ahmadu Bamba by Michelle Kimberly. Ahmadu Bamba, of course, was the great freedom fighter, the guy who fought against French colonialism in Senegal, but did so through non-violent means and was very successful. Also became the founder of the Muridiya Sufi order, and I made a video on him that you can check out. Here's a book on Inayat Khan, the great Chishti Sufi master who came to Europe and was the first one really to spread Sufism in the West in the 20th century. This is edited by his grandson, Pir Zia Inayat Khan, and contains some really great articles by different scholars about him, his life, and his writings, and his music, and his legacy. So, really great book. Here I've got two books by Ugunake, a great scholar of West African Sufism. This is on the Tijaniya and compares it to certain indigenous traditions. And here's a book on praise poetry for the Prophet Muhammad in that West African tradition. Also a book on female sheikhs or female Sufi authorities in West Africa in that same kind of tradition. Here's a book by Martin Lings, the Sufi saint of the 20th century. It's about this Shadili Sufi saint called Ahmed al-Alawi, who was the master he's a founder of a branch of his own, the Shadili Alawi branch, which also was very popular among some of those perennialist authors, among them Martin Lings, who wrote this book. But it's very, very good. Journey of a Sufi Musician by the great Turkish Sufi ney player Kudsi Ergüner. Here's a book on Salafism, some books on Islamism, Islam in Sweden by my old supervisor Simon Sorgenfrey, Sufi Music and Society. This is a good book for that topic, specifically in Turkey. Let's focus on Turkey. Liana Safes, the Arabic influence on the early modern occult philosophy. Highly recommended book as well. A book on Tsar, a book on India in the Persianate Age, a historical book on that topic. Sacred Sound. This is a book. Oh right, so here this is actually the end of the Islam section. This is the end of the Islam section and essentially the end of the religion section as well. And here actually begins the music section, which begins with this book by Guy Beck, the guy who wrote those books about sacred sound in Hinduism. This is sacred sound in all sort of different religions. Beautiful book. Here's an amazing book on music in ancient China and how music was used politically, religiously, philosophically, all different kinds of perspectives. A book on music in ancient Greece, 2 books on Indian music, essentially, one just on music and musical thought in early India, and then a book on rasa theory. Rasa theory is this theory of aesthetics and theater in India, associated with different figures, among them Abhinavagupta of Kashmir Shaivism fame, who very much developed this rasa theory even further in the 11th century. Music and Musicians in the Medieval Islamic World by Lisa Nielsen. Performing Al-Andalus, it's about sort of Andalusian music. It's also about, I think, Syrian contemporary music. This is a book on just... this is just some mandolin music notation for when I want to play the mandolin. And that's basically this bookshelf. Now what we need to do... so what we need to do, I think, here is we need to move over back there to finish up the music section, and then maybe that'll be it. Maybe I'll have to continue with the rest of it at another time. But let's move over to what is essentially my vinyl collection. But at the bottom there are some books, so we're gonna go over there. Okay, so here is some LPs, some vinyl albums, and down here are some books. In there is some of my wife's literature. Here is a recently published journal on Sufi music. Here's a beautiful book. Sorry, this is getting out of hand. This is a really, really beautiful book. Chin. It's on the instrument called chin. Unfortunately, it's in Swedish, but it's one of the most beautiful books that I own. Today, this instrument is known as the guqin. It's a Chinese instrument. This is about the history of the instrument, the symbolism of the instrument, the incredibly complex spiritual, dimensions of that instrument, and all that stuff. It's really just a book dedicated entirely to this beautiful instrument, and it just looks incredible. It's got beautiful illustrations. Let me see if I can show you some of them. You can see here, right? It's got images of the instrument itself, of a bunch of different things. There's the instrument, right? Strings. It covers so many different aspects of the guqin, and really, really beautiful. It was written by Cecilia Lindqvist, who unfortunately also passed away just a few years ago. But this is, again, one of the most beautiful books that I own. Other than that, there isn't much here that belongs to me. This is a book on ghosts, spirits, and the supernatural. And then there is a bookshelf over here. There is a mandolin, my mandolin. And we've got a book on folk music in Sweden, a book on Bach, Cambridge Companion to Bach, a book on the Indian music in the West, how that influenced the West, especially in the mid-20th century. Some books on Gustav Fröding, the great Swedish poet here. And that's basically it for the music section. Now, after the music section here starts a section on history, basically. And how do I distinguish between religion and history? I don't know. And sometimes it doesn't make that much sense, but this is the way I've done it. And I think just for the fact that I'm going to be I won't have energy to keep talking and say interesting things. So I think I'm going to cut it off here. This has been the second part of my bookshelf tour. I hope you found that interesting. This was the religion and music section of my secondary sources. Last time we covered the primary sources section. Next time, if you want a next time, we can go through the history section, and there's also a fiction section. Again, if you're interested, I hope this wasn't too messy. The fact that I had to do this myself and just holding the camera. Yeah, that's it. I hope you're having a good day. I'm looking forward to bringing you some exciting new content very soon. Right now, I'm probably in Italy, recording some interesting stuff for you. And I'll see you in the next video.